Looks like we are live with another episode of the Manny Wolfe Show, where I do try every day to bring you good conversations with great minds. At the risk of doing what I always do when I get to interview this guy, I'm going to give him an obsequious compliment right off the bat and put him on the spot. My friend Ari Meisel, who is, in my opinion, definitely a great mind. Thank you, Ari. So good to have you here. In all sincerity, I love every time I get to talk to you. And I chose to call this interview "How to Have the Strength of 10 Men." And hopefully that'll get some people's attention. But what I really mean is how to easily do the work of 10, 20, 30, 50, or 100 people, which is kind of your specialty. Yeah. Why don't you tell us in your words what your specialty is, and we'll just sort of go from there.
Yeah. So my origination, or the original program that I started creating, was called Less Doing, which was really focused on personal productivity. And over the years, that's after lots of coaching and speaking and books and whatnot, that's morphed into more of a business focused methodology, which I call the replaceable founder. And the idea is to make everybody as replaceable as possible, not replaced, but replaceable. And to do that, we need to create systems and processes, empower teams, and ultimately optimize, automate, and outsource everything that we do. So at this point, I would say that I work with entrepreneurs for the most part, and companies that have opportunity in excess of what their infrastructure will support, to put those systems and processes in place. And a lot of the systems that I created are somewhat counter to some of the other more popular productivity systems out there.
Tell us what opportunity in excess, tell us what that means, because that sounded really fancy. And it gave me a little entrepreneurial tingle, but I think we better get a little more specific as to what we're talking about here.
Yeah. So basically, if I'm dealing with successful entrepreneurs, right? So I've worked with, over the years, like every possible kind of company and every different size. But I don't really work with like fledgling companies, startups, and things like that. I don't work with people who haven't sort of gotten a hold of what they're doing, figured out their product or their service, and have customers. And so the companies that I like to deal with are the ones who have, you know, a lead list of 200 people and they only have the capacity to service 4 of them.
Right. Yeah.
Or the people that, as many people have had the opportunity with the current pandemic, some people's businesses have exploded, you know, because of what's been happening, and they're just completely unprepared for it. So those kind of situations are the ones that I really like to sink my teeth into, because it's almost like a numbers game. There's just more to work with, right? So better sample size.
And so what you do is you find out everywhere in the, let's call it the awareness, indoctrination, enrollment, and fulfillment, right? The whole sort of life cycle of whatever they're doing. And you go in and you find all the places where maybe, to borrow from the title of this interview, the heavy lifting is being done by a human that doesn't need to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's certainly like an investigative aspect to what we do, because I like that. There's an expression that I like, which is you can't read the label from inside the jar. Right. So you see these business owners all the time, and just not even owners, just workers at every level, who are so inundated with stuff and so overwhelmed with whatever they're working on that they don't have the possibility of having that sort of outside view and seeing what's going on. But when I come in sort of with my lens, it's a lot more straightforward to figure out where the holdups are and really where the bottlenecks are.
Yeah. Now, here's a question I know I can get some value out of, and I would wager this is going to be pretty universal. Do the places where we can't see the label from inside the jar tend to be the same most of the time?
Yes. Great question. So I was talking to somebody about this yesterday, and I really put some thought to it for a few minutes. And I said that I think I've probably coached upwards of 500 people over the last 9 years. Yeah. And I think that I could put every single one of their problems into one of 5 buckets, basically. Right. So, and in businesses, it's 3 buckets.
It's how many?
3.
Okay. Get your pens and pencils out, because you're going to want to know this. So the first one is communications. The second one is project management. And the third one is processes.
I would say that covers the gamut of 99% of the problems that I see in businesses. And furthermore, communications is probably 80% of those problems.
No kidding. Because so that the world here knows, I'm on your email list, and I love seeing your thought process via your emails. And I see you talking about communication and communications a lot. And sometimes I'm not sure I know exactly what you mean. So would you expand on that here? Can I just gratuitously take this opportunity to,
100%.
Yeah.
So there's a few different facets of it, right? So the first one is sort of how we communicate, literally the mechanics of like the words that we're using and the way that people really fail at conveying success. To illustrate this, one of the things that I always love to ask whenever I give a talk somewhere, I always like to say, like, how many of you have ever outsourced something, right? Mm-hmm. And, a large percentage of the audience will raise their hands. And then I say, great, now how many of you have ever had a bad experience outsourcing something?
Right.
And inevitably, more people raise their hands than originally answered the question, right? That's typically the fault of the delegator, right? Because, again, we're really bad, generally speaking, at conveying what success looks like, at providing the proper resources, and ultimately at empowering people. So there's the mechanical aspect of, or the mechanics of the communication issues. The second one is the sort of logistics of how we communicate and like what systems we tend to use. So people will use the wrong tools for the wrong type of communication. So an example there, and I can expound on any of these that you want, is that email is a terrible no tool for internal communication. It's something that we are very strict about when we work with clients. You should not be using email as an internal communication tool. You have to use something else. It doesn't matter if it's Slack or it doesn't matter, honestly, but it should not be email. And most companies are doing that, including some very, very large companies. I did a talk last week for a company that is, I can't name them, but it's one of the biggest players in the tech world, and they make their own email system, and their employees are drowning in email because they're not using it correctly. So it's a very, very common issue. And then the third one is the actual sort of philosophical idea behind delegation itself, and understanding that it's not about micromanagement, it's really about empowerment. And also, we don't want to delegate as this sort of knee-jerk reaction in terms of like, oh, I don't want to do this thing, it's too hard, I'm just going to find somebody else to do it. But that person that I'm going to find to do it, generally speaking, has less experience, less information, less context than I do. And yet at the same time, I expect a result that is better than the result that I would produce myself. So you're just setting everybody up for failure.
Right, yeah.
So it sort of breaks down into those three subtopics.
So I know that I guess there's a couple of things here. I feel like we're about to get to something that I first learned talking to you, asynchronous communication.
Yes.
It's a very fancy phrase. And I'm feeling like Slack or WhatsApp or one of those internal communication platforms, do those, first of all, what's asynchronous communication? And second of all, do those lend themselves to it better? Or is there a fundamental shift we have to make as a team in our understanding about the communication rhythm?
The latter. You really have to have this sort of fundamental shift. So what is asynchronous communication, right? So it's the opposite of what you and I are doing right now. This would be synchronous communication, right? Yeah. And there's obviously a time and a place for synchronous communication, but asynchronous is really something that people are doing every day in some form or fashion. Texting is asynchronous. Email is supposed to be asynchronous. Slack, WhatsApp, all of these kinds of tools are asynchronous means, which means that I can send a message whenever I want. The person on the other end can receive it whenever they want, and they can respond whenever they want, and you can receive it, and so on and so forth. So if you understand the value of asynchronous communication, you use it the right way, you're effectively allowing everybody in that loop to communicate at a time that is most effective for them, which is hard to argue against, right?
Right.
The problem is that a lot of people are using these tools and treating them like a synchronous communication tool. So perfect example is the person that sends a text message, right? And they send it, and then they're waiting, and they watch the three dots going, and they're waiting, and they're watching. And it's like opening a portal, through your possible zone of productivity.
Yeah.
Where what you should be doing is you send the message, put it down, and go back to what you're doing.
Right.
If they respond, you get to it when you're done doing the thing that you're focusing on right now. Now, we push that limit a lot, especially now, where a lot of the things that people would just assume and are used to doing in a synchronous fashion, such as daily huddles or sales calls is another good one. These are things that we have seen and shown can be done really effectively, and many times more effectively, in an asynchronous fashion. So the daily stand-up is a great example. A lot of people, especially if you look at things like the Rockefeller habits, or there's all sorts of methodologies that tell you to have a daily stand-up, which I think is a great idea. The issue is that everybody's sort of on a different rhythm. Everybody's and it's not just like two people in the same time zone even, but you and I are in two different time zones.
Yeah.
There's all these issues that come up. So to think that you're going to set a team meeting at 9 a.m. on Monday morning and the 5 people or the 50 people in that meeting are going to somehow be in sync is just crazy.
Yeah.
So we can do that asynchronously, and we can do this sort of round robin process, which we do in our team and all the companies we work with. And in our team, a message pops up every morning. And in our case, we use a tool called Voxer, which is my favorite communication tool in existence. And it pops up and it says, "What are you going to do today, team? Check in." And so everybody checks in, and there's 5 people on my team, which is not huge, but sometimes it takes 20 minutes for all of us to check in. Sometimes it takes 5 hours. But every single day, we are all getting on the same page, and it keeps us connected in that manner. I've done sales calls over Voxer asynchronously, customer service issues, coaching, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You can do a lot of this stuff asynchronously. And the last thing I'll just say, I know it was like a long sort of string of things. The last thing I'll say about that is that you can have an enormously larger amount of conversations in an enormously shorter amount of time. So if I get off this call with you and there's 5 Voxer messages that are a minute each, let's say, I listen to them for 5 minutes, I can probably respond to all 5 of them in 2 or 3 minutes, right? So in 10 minutes or in 8 minutes, I've had 5 full conversations basically, and things can continue to progress.
So looking at it, on the surface from 100 feet up or whatever, I'm saying, yeah, that sounds phenomenal. And I also recognize a couple of things, the sort of the idiosyncratic and sort of gut check way that synchronous communication tends to happen, meaning that. So let me see if I could get this. Meaning that it's like the example I read in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I'm guessing you know that book. Yeah. Stephen Covey talks about how the peculiarity of I could be talking to you. It could be a jugular conversation. And if the phone rings, I'm almost always going to say, "Give me just a second." And it's going to somehow, for some reason, irrationally trump this conversation that's happening right here. And that's what I mean by kind of like when it's synchronous, there's that idiosyncratic like tendency to deprioritize the conversation a little bit to distractions. Yeah. But so talk to me a little bit about what you alluded to earlier about how we need to shift our thinking and our approach to the communication in order for these asynchronous methods to be more effective. There has to be a shift in the people, right? A little bit in their understanding. Yeah,
100%. So look, as you know very well, like I love technology. I'm very big.
Yeah. You're a fan. Yeah.
But tech will never solve the problem. Tech is going to amplify habits, basically, right? So good habits better, and bad habits will make them much, much worse. So everything that we teach, there's 90% of it is really about sort of the mindset and the approach that we take to this stuff. So the shift from sort of the synchronous to the asynchronous, a lot of times is really just like a big cultural one. And it's just some, people are just used to it. Salespeople are a really good example. You take like an old salesperson or I'd say previous generation salesperson.
Yeah.
Right? And the idea of, not like hunkering down on the phone and like getting in front of the prospect, right? Like that's just crazy. There's no way you're going to close a sale. Now, obviously, you're doing like a multi-million-dollar deal. You probably need to do that. But for most salespeople, that's not the case. And the sales one is a really good example. So the first time I ever did it, we had a webinar and people registered. And after they registered, we said, if you want to talk to Ari right now, you can use this tool called Voxer. It's awesome, blah, blah. So it was a Sunday morning at 7:50 in the morning. And I got a 3-minute long message from a stranger telling me about his business and what his problems were. And it was 7:50 in the morning. I was getting the kids sort of up and we were making breakfast. And so like an hour and a half later, maybe I responded to him with a minute-long message with a couple questions and some clarifications. 6 hours later, he responded to me with another 2-minute message. And then sometime around 11 o'clock that night, I responded and I was ready to go to bed. And about 2 minutes later, he made his purchase, right? So there was the entire exchange of audio message was like 11 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. And over the course of a day. But what that does is like, I get to think about my answer and really give the response I want. He does too. We're not rushed because we're in the situation and we're not trying to shoehorn. And this is always fascinating to me, right? We're not trying to, this is going to sound weird, right? We're not trying to shoehorn an 11-minute conversation into a 15-minute block of time.
Yeah, no, I get it. Yeah.
So just as I love this, one of my favorite statistics of all time is that like the average nonfiction book has roughly 12 pages of actual content in it. That's like an average, right? The rest of it is sort of fluff and stuff. That's how most conversations and definitely most meetings are, right? So this allows you to really cut through that noise. So if you can show how much more effective it is to people, that usually really helps with that shift. But again, a lot of it really is just this sort of cultural, historical belief that it's about FaceTime.
Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about, this is one of my favorite things about what you do, or at least it's certainly the most relevant to me. Let's talk a little bit about whether or not content is still king.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah. You've heard that, right? You've heard the people getting up and saying, oh, tired of, like basically trying to sell you something by saying content is not super, super important.
Yeah. I think that content is king. I think that now more than ever, content is king. I think that, obviously depending on the business, but for most businesses in the current situation, I don't believe that like the expectation of growth is reasonable. If you're sort of maintaining your status quo and continuing your business and like surviving, and I think that's great. If you're thriving, that's amazing. But I think surviving is a really sort of good bar for most people at this point. And now I think more than ever is the time not to be selling things to people per se, but really establishing who you are and your brand and your authority. And I saw some quote from a friend of mine that was just perfect for this. He said, if you see somebody drowning, that's not the time to try to sell them a course on swimming, right?
Yeah.
That's beautiful. The time to throw them a lifeboat or, a life jacket or whatever and pull them to shore and wrap them in a towel, right? So like, and that's content. Like you can't do that with anything other than content. Yeah. Plus, content is really ultimately, I think, what makes any individual unique. You take a real estate broker, there's a billion or, a million real estate brokers that are essentially cookie cutter versions of every other real estate broker. I don't mean any disrespect to real estate brokers because I was one. But as a sort of baseline profession, they're a commodity. What makes them unique is their sort of knowledge and their perspective. And the only way to sort of share that is through content. Like
their personality, right?
Yeah, which has to come through in content. And that's what's going to get you that audience. And the last thing I'll say about that too is, and this is based on an article from, what was his name? Kevin something, the editor-in-chief of Wired, but this is like 15 years old. And it was an article called 1,000 True Fans, right? And yeah. So ultimately in most businesses, that's what you need, right? You need 1,000 true fans. You don't need a million sort of wishy-washy people. You need 1,000 true fans. And I think that, I'm not going to say it's the only way, but I think that content is the clearest way to get there. Yeah.
The idea being that 1,000 raving fans can easily make you, it could easily make you a $1 million a year business.
Yeah, right. Easily.
Yeah, easily. I'm not there yet, but I just do want to speak to the veracity of that, even at the level that, where I don't know how many true fans I have, but I know that most of the business I actually do is with people who have already worked with me.
Yeah.
Most of my income, 70% is, and it's really cool. This is one of the gifts of content and the gifts of social media that I feel like a lot of people miss, because social media it's like an arcade full of pachinko games, right? It's really loud and busy and bopping all over the place. You know what I mean? But if you're able to see it for what it is, this almost virtually no cost opportunity to get in front of a global audience, as some of us think of it, you can do amazing things, and you can do them, God, for just pennies on the dollar. But so before we go down that, before I take the tractor and yank it off into the field there, I'd love to hear your solutions and your thoughts on, I see people who embrace the idea of content being king, and then they wind up spending just untold amounts of time managing multiple platforms, managing all, just spending their time doing content. And the problem that I see with those people when it's a business for them is either extreme hours, burnout, or they don't have any time to actually fulfill or coach or sell or, because everything's about the content. What are your thoughts there? I mean, I'm obviously pitching you a softball, slow, fat, and over the plate here, but how do you engage with that? How do you grapple with that?
So I wrote an article on Medium a while back called "How to Create 1 Month of Content in 1 Minute." Yeah. And it was not in any shape or form hyperbolic, right? Like that is literally something that I have created a system to do. So a lot of that takes place through automation, some of it through outsourcing. But the fascinating thing with me about that content issue and the content dissemination and everything is that people use it as such an excuse all the time. It's like, oh, I know I need to be creating content. I know I need to have a podcast, right? But I just don't have the time to put it all together.
Yeah.
Do you have time to talk for a couple of minutes?
Yeah, exactly.
It doesn't require that much, right? So I have set up a system, which I can describe quickly and briefly there, where essentially I can do a 1 minute or 3 minute, 5 minute, whatever, a couple minute Facebook Live. And I can do that while I'm, walking my dog out in our field here, or I can do it, right before I go to bed at night. It doesn't take much effort or time. And I do it at a time when it's really natural for me. So it sort of comes out really well. I'm really good at walking and talking. So I can do videos walking like all day long. That's why you got to have a stabilizer. But I do the Facebook Live. And from that, through a series of automations and outsourcing, we get a podcast, an audio podcast, a YouTube video of that audio podcast, a originally written by a copywriter with full SEO juice in it article of 1,000 to 2,000 words. We get 12 months of social media posting out of that automatically, things like tweets and stuff with the quote cards and all that kind of things. Social media videos, those like really fancy little videos that people pop up and, have the words and stuff on them. And I think that's it. So all of those things happen from 1 or 2 minutes of my original content, which I can do a few times a week without even having to think about it. Yeah. And there's no excuse at that point for why I can't put content out. Not to mention the top writer on Medium is Benjamin Hardy, who's been on my podcast a couple of times, and he appears to be a really prolific writer. And he's like the most followed person on Medium. He republishes his articles every 8 to 10 months, exact same article with a different title. And he doesn't hide that at all, and it just exposes it to new people. So that's the other thing, is that you don't have to be constantly creating new content either.
Yeah. So what are some of the benefits of finally figuring out how to become a prolific content creator, whether it's through automation or whatever? I think this is something that people really can't hear enough if they're doing business in the online space.
Yeah, I think it really boils down to like that idea of putting yourself out there, right?
Yeah.
And it's funny. So when I started my first company when I was 12, right, with website design,
Yeah,
and
right, right.
a couple more before I was graduated high school, and I was always really intentional that anytime I had a conversation with anybody, I would mention my company. I would somehow work it into the conversation.
Yeah.
Very, very, again, intentionally. And because you never know, right? You never know who might need a website. You never know who might know somebody who they should introduce you to. But if you don't put that out there, you don't explain what you do, you don't describe it, you don't give the opportunity for somebody to take advantage of, then it's just not going to happen, right? So the idea of not putting content out there is actively turning down opportunities. That's just the way I kind of see it. And people should see it that way as too. It's not just like you're not taking advantage of opportunity, you are actively saying no to things.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. I know that I have come around to the point of view or the belief, I guess, that this thing that I call indirect ROI is maybe in the long run more powerful than the things that you can put a dollar in and chart every sort of KPI of what the dollar does. Do you know what I mean when I say indirect ROI? Do you know what I'm referring to, or should I elaborate?
I think so, but
yeah. So I'm talking about another way of talking about it is building trust and goodwill way ahead of time. And that's kind of what you're talking about, right? I mean, that's what lots and lots of presence on lots and lots of platforms does for us. It allows people to decide how they feel about us way before an offer comes down the pike.
Yeah, 100%. You can tell so much, I think, from people's sort of content style, the way that they talk, the tonality, the use or not use of swear words, right? Like there's so much you can see about something. And there's some people who own that personality and really work it very well. There's people online, like the get rich quick kind of people that are online all the time. There's a particular sort of like, flavor to it, is actually to it. So you can identify that very quickly. And I've had people tell me countless times, they're like, oh, I saw this YouTube video, I saw that article. It's like, you seem really legit.
Yeah.
Like, okay, great, thanks. So it helps. It really does help. And also, for better or worse, we're in a time when, and I don't mean coronavirus, I just mean in general, like we're in a time where people Google people, right? So if nothing comes up on somebody, I think that's weird in a lot of cases, right? So
it's cause to take pause. It really is,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more. So let's talk a little bit about, you're a father. You've seen, and this is a total non sequitur, but you've seen the school and education model change quite a bit because of the coronavirus situation. I'm curious, with your unique sort of skill set, like you're like the Liam Neeson of tech automation. What do you see happening with school? What do you see as some potential changes that might come for better, mostly for better, is what I'm worried or curious about, that might come as a result of this?
Yeah, so I'll try to sort of contextualize this as I answer it. I have 4 children, 8 and under, and they're in 2 different schools. So 3 of them are in one school and 1 is at another school. And so so the interesting thing about that, and they're 2 very, very different schools. And I've seen a really interesting sort of dichotomy in terms of how one school handles it really, really well and how one school, in my opinion, doesn't handle it really, really well. Yeah. And they're using different platforms, which is also fascinating. So one school is using Microsoft Teams, which I have come to loathe. And I, as somebody who knows the ins and outs of basically every project management tool that exists, I'm very, very sort of, I wouldn't say the surprise, but I'm just disappointed in the way that this one works. And also, it's just, in my opinion, not well suited for this use. Google Classroom, on the other hand, is a shockingly excellent platform. that I've
Okay.
been surprised with. It's totally free and it works really, really well. And it integrates really well with Google Docs and with Google Calendar and all this stuff. And it's great. And then on the other hand, one school is using Zoom, which is great. And the other school is using Google Meet, which I don't think is so great. So in terms of like what's going to come out of this, I think that there's an opportunity for several companies to create much better platforms to do this kind of distance learning and manage that process really well.
Yeah.
And honestly, like to me, it takes somebody who's like a really good project manager to sort of understand this and create a platform, because that's something that's really missing in Microsoft Teams for this use. So that's one, is that I think that there's going to be a lot more technological support going forward for whenever they end up going back to school, whatever that might be.
Yeah.
The other thing, and this may be a more individual experience, but we have really gotten into discovering several really, really excellent apps for the kids' iPads that they're able to use. And the one like Duolingo, for example, which is a really good language learning app, because two of the kids are learning Chinese. And so the nice thing with some of these apps, and there's lots and lots that are just total crap, but there's some real diamonds in the rough for the educational apps. And the overriding feature that I think is really great is the self-pacing and self-adjusting aspect, right? So as the child struggles with one, it'll make that easier. And as they get better at one, it'll make it harder. And it individualizes education in a way that teachers can't possibly, right? Wow. With a larger group.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that, and I would hope, honestly, that some of these apps start to take the place of homework in some cases, because I think it provides just a more accurate view. And just as there's thousands of, probably hundreds at least, studies on the issues with standardized testing and how they're biased towards minorities and towards there's all sorts of issues, and some people are just not good test takers, right? So that idea of putting everybody through this sieve and hoping that it works out doesn't work. So adding in these elements, I think, really adds the individualization, which, if I had to say the one thing that I think that makes education better, is the ability to tailor individually to any given student's needs and interests.
Yeah, I completely agree. Fascinating, the idea about these apps that can sort of flex with how fast the kid's progressing. I hadn't even considered that. I want to be respectful of your time, my friend, and I want to thank you so much for showing up and sharing your insights today. It genuinely is always really, really nice. Really a treat to talk with you. So we will we'll cut it off here. We'll say goodbye. We'll thank you for your time. And if anybody wants to get a hold of Ari, what's the best way to do so?
So they can find everything at lessdoing.com. The one thing I'd particularly like to point people's attention to is that we have a virtual workshop coming up at the end of this month, May 28th and 29th, in the evening. So from 9 to 11 p.m. Eastern time each night, which has been proving to be a really good sort of time slot with the current environment. And people can find out more about that at lessdoing.com, and they look at the replaceable founder intensive. I think it could be really helpful.
Cool. Can you stick around in the green room for a couple of minutes?
Of course.
Great. All right. Thanks so much, Ari.